Welcome to another episode of the Inciting Incident, where we explore those pivotal moments that create the man, the myth, and the legend, who they are today. And today we have Dr. Hemal Patel, who is a tenured professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of California, San Diego, and has a dual appointment as a VA research career scientist and research pharmacologist at the VA San Diego healthcare system. He is also the chief advisor for Versailles Discovery. He obtained his PhD in pharmacology and toxicology from the Medical College of Wisconsin and did postdoctorate work at UCSD in the Department of Pharmacology under Paul Insel from 2002 to 2005. He has made seminal contributions in shaping new investigation areas and defining the impact of membrane structure on cell, organ, and organismal, if I say that right, physiology and metabolism with implications for cardiac ischemia, reperfusion injury, that's a mouthful, heart failure, diabetic cardiomyopathy, aging, pulmonary hypertension, cancer, and neurodegeneration. His focus is on energetics and cell biology, touches upon all of these, and is a control point for managing and empowering human health resilience. Wow, I have to work on my reading skills. Anyway, welcome.
Yeah, good to see you, Tim.
You too. I've known Dr. Hemal for quite a few years. And then in December, we hung out in a hotel room working with some, what do you call that, that thing we were playing with? Anyway, biohacking stuff.
Yeah, we were biohacking ourselves, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And he didn't actually know it, but I was kind of priming him at that moment for this future podcast. So I'm going to open up with what I asked you, which was, who were you, where were you, and did you have any idea what you want to do at age 17?
At 17, so I knew I wanted to go into science. And one of the things that as a brown kid growing up in the Midwest, you had choices of was, if you go into science, you had to become an MD, right? That would qualify you as a successful brown kid that made it and sort of got out of the generational sort of issues. The other choice you had was to go to law school and become a lawyer. Lawyers were valued at that time in the 90s and stuff. And there, you had a community status that you could build out of that. So I was super interested in science. I was good at math and science, all the STEM kinds of things. And so that was my impetus to know that that's where I wanted to go. In my mind, the thing that sort of sat at the front center was I had to be a doctor in some way, because that was what was sort of imprinted from a very young age. And that was the path forward. It's interesting how you have such a deep connection to where you want to be. And sometimes that's not where you're meant to be. And so I go to college. So I guess before that, the other thing that happens is you fall in love, you meet people, these things happen. So I met my wife, who now we've been married over 25 years, in high school, right? We knew each other all through high school. We went to senior prom together, and that created a trajectory as well, right? She was very science oriented as well. We were all in the advanced classes. We ended up going to the same university, and she was not brown. I mean, she's Caucasian, grew up in the same town, same house. In terms of ideology, was very similar to my upbringing, had a really strong family structure, parents who had a loving marriage and were really invested in the future of their kids. But on the surface, it was very different. She was raised as a Catholic and I was raised as a Hindu. And so there was this clash of cultures in a unique way that on the surface level was very religious oriented, but then everything was different, right? We had different clothes we would wear to parties and things. We had different foods that we grew up with and experiencing. And so for me, as I transitioned from this 17-year-old self to becoming a young adult and trying to find my path, medicine was at the forefront of this, but then all of this stuff came clashing together. In college, I started exploring elements of my background that I never really thought much about. I was raised a Hindu, but never really took that all in. I had a spirituality where I believed that something bigger than myself existed, but never really knew what that was. Whereas my wife had a very concrete person that she sort of tied to, right? The Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit, all of that the Trinity that sort of ties with Catholicism. And so I did almost a 360 in college. I went to a small liberal arts school, very good science program. And so that was my declared major. And then it was a liberal arts program. And so you had to take sort of exploratory classes in areas that are not your expertise. And so I thought, being, in this relationship and not really knowing where and where my mind and head was headed, maybe I'll take a survey class on philosophy just to see what that ignites. I fell in love with philosophy.
I was a philosophy and writing major, so
right, and
yeah.
and it was the professor was this just eclectic, weird individual who was just amazing and made you think about the world in a way that I'd never really thought about. And I did really well in her class, and so she came up to me at the end of the quarter and said, "Hey, I'm teaching another class. You want to?" I was hoping that you would take it, and so I signed up for that. And then after that class, she's like, have you ever thought about being a minor in philosophy? I'm like, you have to do a couple more classes. And so the minor turned into a second major. And so I ended up double majoring in biology and philosophy, religion.
Wow.
And I really started to explore religion because this was one of the things, right? I grew up as a Hindu, knew very little about Hinduism other than the superstitious things we did at home and the cultural things you were exposed to. And I was dating at the time this Catholic woman who I knew nothing about Western theology. And so I immersed myself into this and really started trying to think about Western and Eastern theology and how they come together, and then using philosophy as a background. And so it sort of scared my parents that I was going down this other path that was not biologically relevant. And it was, taking me away from this medical path. But interestingly, science people become scientists and physicians, and philosophy people either work at McDonald's or they become lawyers, right? And so you've got
writers, I guess.
Or writers, right? That's the other sort of aspect to it. And so I grew up in a circle of people that had those two things that made complete sense for someone of my sort of Asian background to get into, this idea of either law or medicine. Ultimately, science won out. I'd gone through this path of always wanting to be a physician, but I started doing research very early in my undergraduate career. And it was something that really appealed to me, right? Nature aspects of my mind and how I work and how I create. Research was an easy thing to sort of come to. You had a problem that was a big problem that you couldn't solve, and you had to think your way around this and to design the right type of experiment to show you what already exists there. And so this is the nature of how to connect philosophy with biology, right? Life exists and all these processes are working. And what scientists are essentially trying to do is figure out something that already exists in a more understandable way to make other people understand and to grow the science and to understand and manipulate that biology in a unique kind of way. This appealed to me. I was good at it. I was a good experimentalist. I had good hands. I could do right experiments. Things worked out. And so then I decided not to go down that MD path and really become this PhD. And when I went to my parents with this idea, I was going to go to grad school and get a PhD. The first question was, what is that? Because the concept didn't make any sense. And then the next question was, what are you going to get your PhD in? And I said, my advisor suggested I do pharmacology because it gives you access to every living system. And no concept of what that was. So their idea was, well, if you get a PhD in pharmacology, you're going to work at Walgreens or CVS. I'm like, no, that's not what a pharmacologist does. That's what a pharmacist does, right? And so all of these layers that you have to get over. And I hit my element. When I got to grad school, it was the most fun time in my life that I've ever had, surrounded by people who think outside the box, thinking about problems and how to solve them. And this is where that big word comes in, right? Ischemia, reperfusion, injury. So that was what I studied for my PhD, was how do you protect the heart from ischemic injury?
And can you say what ischemic is? And an ischemic injury
is basically depriving an organ of nutrients in blood, right? And so when you make that organ ischemic, you give it a barrier that prevents the blood from going to that. So an easy example for a heart is a coronary blockage, right? So if your coronaries are blocked, They prevent those blood nutrients from getting to that heart tissue. The heart tissue becomes essentially living in an oxygen deprived environment, doesn't have access to nutrients and things it needs to create energy, and you have a heart attack. And so we were trying to figure out, how do you fix the heart from this massive heart attack? And are there drugs that you can ultimately give, but are there programs that the body has sort of inlaid in doing this? Hindsight's 2020, and I'm sure we're going to talk about work we're doing with Joe right now with sort of mind and body and how things are connected. And it's interesting when you look back at my research career, we were already looking at the power of the body in my PhD work, but I never thought of how amazing the human body is. So it turns out in the late 80s, there was this medical student working on a project where they were trying to create these heart attacks in a large animal model. And they wanted to create a bigger injury. And so they came up with this idea of giving the heart small bursts of a heart attack and then a long heart attack to see if they could create a massive injury that happens. Paradoxically, what happened was that the heart was actually protected from injury. So by giving it these little small 2-minute bursts of deprivation of oxygen and nutrients, the heart learned. So it has an endogenous imprinted system that learns from that stressor. And now when you give it this massive heart attack, it knows exactly how to respond and it doesn't die, right? It's not injured. It's protected. And so scientists for the last 40 years have been trying to figure out how the body naturally creates this program and can we drug this in a unique kind of way? And so it's interesting how powerful our bodies are and how powerful the design actually is and what the information is there and how to unleash it in a unique kind of way. And it goes back to philosophy as well, right? Nietzsche had it right. That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? This concept that there's systems that are adapted in our biology that respond to stress in a positive and negative way. If you could somehow make them respond in a positive way, there's a huge resilience benefit that comes at the end of it.
It's interesting. Do you think there's many scientists that have a philosophy background? It's a pretty interesting intersection.
I mean, I was probably I was probably a unicorn at my university at the time. I don't think there were any other people that were getting a dual degree in biology and philosophy of religion, right? It gives you a perspective that you never think about in biology.
Yeah. It's interesting when you're, where you are now. It's always easier to look back, but there's some sort of divine guidance system sort of guiding you along the way. I think when you're in alignment with your mind, body, and spirit, you are passionate about what you're doing. There is this guidance system. And so I was kind of curious about you converted to Catholicism. At some point, I was curious about your faith and spirituality and how that intersects with your science.
Yeah, so my wife was a cradle Catholic, and so she was. This was her way to stress relief. Her relationship with God was very strong, and it was a connected relationship, very strong prayer life. She would go to mass every week, even through college, and so I would join her because this was my way of being in, sort of doing things that were interesting to her, and I went to church for 16 years. Even after we got married, we went to, we go to church most weeks. And I was always waiting for the crucified Christ to come off the cross and talk to me and bring me in.
Yeah.
And it never happened. And then life happens, right? So my mom passed away. She was 60 and it was likely an MI that she had. She was a type 2 diabetic. And it was a sad part of my life, right? I'm a person who studies how to fix the heart from ischemic injury, and she dies from an ischemic injury. So it's sort of a blow to my science in the sense that I couldn't do what I was doing fast enough to protect her and save her from that aspect. And so I went into this really sort of dark tailspin, and it really questioned who and what I was. And she was the spiritual center in my life. I mean, she's the one that connected us to spirituality. And she was the most religious sort of aspect to it. She had her guru and was very devoted and stuff like that. And that was gone. And so my connection to that sort of evaporated. And so I went through a really dark time. And when you do this, things happen either in a positive or a negative way. And like you mentioned, right, maybe there's a divine hand that played a role in this, but I had a series of dreams where I had sort of reflections on this priest that we were interacting with at our church. And he appeared in my dreams, and he was in this olive grove, and we had these interactions, and I would try to go find him, and he would disappear, and I'd go to this next place and he'd be gone. And it was me seeking something that I knew was there in my mind, but couldn't get to, right? And then, of all places, Netflix sort of snapped it in place for me. I was watching this Bible series on Netflix, which was actually really well done.
Do you remember what it's called?
It was called The Bible.
Okay.
I don't know if it's still on, but it was an amazing series. And it basically goes through in episodic ways different elements of the Bible. And so I'd read the Bible probably 3 times in college in various classes. So I dove deep. So I took every Western theology class you could think of. So I took Judaism, which is where you have to start, right? And then the Apostle Paul, Jesus of Nazareth. I even took Koine Greek so I could read the original Bible in the Greek language to get at the core text of it. So I poured myself into that. And I could understand the Bible as a historical document, right? I have no questions that Jesus existed as a historical figure. But as someone who's outside of the faith, I couldn't bring myself to that faith aspect, this belief that someone you can't wrap your fingers around and ideas around and you can't see now actually is the Son of God and did all these other things. Faith came at a much later time. And there's a scene in these episodes in the Bible where one of the apostles is lamenting the fact that he hasn't seen Christ after he's risen, right? So Christ dies, gets crucified. 3 days later, he rises, and this is how he conquers death, and original sin is washed away. Whatever Adam and Eve did, Christ then resolved. And it's interesting that before he dies, he teaches the apostles how to connect to him. And the way they're supposed to connect to him is through the Eucharist, which is an eating the body and blood of Christ, right? At the Last Supper, he broke bread, gave them wine, and say, "Do this in remembrance of me." This is why the early churches were considered cannibalistic, because they were eating their Savior, right? And there's an element to this, right? If you're a true Catholic, when the priest does the prayer over the bread and wine, there's this concept of transubstantiation, where it truly becomes the body and blood of Christ. And so in this episode, this apostle is lamenting the fact that everyone else has seen Christ and he hasn't, and he was one of the most connected to him. And then he breaks bread. And as soon as he breaks bread, Christ becomes instantly visible to him. And that was the sort of flip switch I had. For 16 years, I participated in this ritual where I would go and see the gospel readings and then the actual sacrifice of the Last Supper that happens every week and every day at Mass. But I wasn't partaking in that. I wasn't taking in that divine spirit. And so I was unlocked from that, right? I didn't have access to it. And so then I started to go deep into this aspect. I actually went through, Catholics don't make it easy. They want to challenge you, right? They want to make sure that what you've decided is really a true decision that you're making. And so I went through this RCIA program, which is the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. It's a year-long program where you're probing and really challenging your belief structures and whether this is the faith that you've decided to go into. And it was a profound series of lectures that were given at our church and interacting with these other people that were going through the same struggle of finding their spirituality and their relationship with God. And I went through that whole process. And then what happens at the end of all of this, the culmination is on Easter Mass. You get baptized, you get confirmed, and you get your first Holy Communion. So it typically takes kids through high school to do. You literally do it in one night. And it was a full immersion baptism. So you literally go down into this water bath that's at our church. And an interesting backstory that connects to my Hindu life in this is when you're an Indian kid, you have a star chart that's read when you're born. And so my star chart said I would die in water. It said a lot of other things, but that was the one thing that stuck in my mom's mind. So I wasn't allowed to swim. I wasn't allowed to go on boats. I had strayed far away from water. I never got to touch water because my mom was so fearful that I would die in it because of what this star chart said. Interestingly, at the age of, ripe age of mid 30s when I converted, I died in water. I was baptized and immersed in this space. And so there is this weird cosmic connection between my other faith and what I grew up in and what I ultimately converted to. And so I went through this baptism and I was expecting this dramatic sort of revealing of the risen Christ and what this apostle saw and like this transformative change. I was scared of water, right? So I was dunked in, more worried about drowning than anything else. Nothing happened. And then I go to the confirmation and sort of the first communion. So you get the host, and so you eat the bread, which is the body of Christ, and then you take a little sip of wine. And we've been together lots of places, and we've had lots of drinks, and I can handle my liquor pretty well. I had a little sip of wine, and I could not walk, right? And so that was my first experience with the divine. It took whatever came in, and it just transformed who and what I was, and it just was a permeating power that was so powerful that I could not stand up. I went back to the pew and I literally had to sit down because I just was jittery and I felt like I was going to pass out. Right.
Yeah.
And so that was my conversion. It was this idea that you had to actually participate in what Jesus said, how you remember him. Right. And that led to this path. And so it's led to this relationship with God that I never really had as a young child. And really has defined my sort of future as an adult and as a parent and as a husband.
That's unbelievable. I love the star chart part as well. Clearly, some sort of divine guidance there. So you've been on a pretty wild ride for the last 4-6 years, ever since your intersection with Dr. Joe Dispenza. How did that happen? And then I guess I'm curious how that has transformed or shaped your perspective even further, because in one way, the consciousness thing is sort of outside of organized religion, but then in the other way, it's completely fundamental to everything.
It is. Yeah. I during the pandemic, I actually gave a presentation at our church on some of the Joe work we were doing with long COVID. And one of the challenges was, how do you present meditation to a Catholic from the Joe world, but in a unique space? Catholics meditate, right? I mean, some of the mystics were some of the major meditators in the Catholic faith, and they had access to ways of thinking about the world that no one else did. And there's a faith aspect to all of this. And so the way I sort of described it to these individuals was, meditation is really a Trinity experience, right? It's God the Father, who's the mind, God the Son, who's the heart, and God the Spirit, which is your lungs, your breath. And so meditation is really about mind, heart, and breath. And that appealed to Catholics in this unique kind of way because it ties it into their belief structure. But how I got to all of that, right? So our mutual friend, Toby Muller-Bertram. So Toby and I were colleagues at UCSD for many years. We were doing the social experiment at the VA. And so this is where I had my first independent office. And it wasn't independent because the chief there said, hey, we can't give you your own office. You have to share with someone. And so the social experiment we were doing is put a PhD in an office with an MD and let's see what happens at the end of the day. The idea is the PhD is going to rub off on the MD and start making them think about questions and ideas and experiments and ways to solve them. And the MD is going to rub off on the PhD and it's going to be like, stop working with your proteins and your mice. Let's think about humans and how we solve human problems. And so Toby and I sat together in this office every day for about 10 years, a decade.
Wow.
We never worked on any problems together. We never solved any big, crazy, amazing thing. We became really good friends. And then he left and started his pain service in the Palm Desert area, which has become really successful. When the opioid crisis hit, he started experimenting with alternative ways to manage pain in his clinic. Meditation was one of them. Hillary Hamilton was working with him at the time and was bringing some of Dr. Joe's work into the clinic. They saw some unique things. He went to a week-long event in Cancun was blown away, like everyone is, right? It's just, you just don't expect to see what you're going to see when you're at these week-long events. And his scientific curiosity mind got to work, and he's like, this is an amazing place to do experiments, right? It's a petri
The
dish.
ultimate petri dish. Yeah.
Perfect petri dish where everyone's in the right place at the right time, same schedule, eating similar types of food. You can control their sleep wake cycle, all of it. And you have large groups of people that you can study at one time. So he went up to Joe and said, we need to study this. And he remembered our 10 years of interaction. And he came to me and said, I have this idea. Let's start working on this, and let's put your crazy science to really work on this, right? Really esoteric stuff that you're doing in the lab is what we need to define what's happening in this Joe space, because we don't know. I mean, it's an open box right now. We need to define and sort of rein in what that box is and where the limits stand. And so we've been trying to rein this in. And every time we do it, there's something else that opens up that just makes that box go even bigger, kind of thing. But it's been great for 5 years.
Yeah, he was telling me last night there was a divider between you, and somebody'd be like, ooh, and like make this amazing grunt, and he'd like run over and look, and you guys would just be running back and forth, sharing kind of ideas.
Yeah. UCSD is one of these amazing places, and it has an amazing faculty that are just constantly just thinking about stuff, right? And I'm glad that he was listening and thinking about it, because we came together to now really solve a problem that needs to be solved and define a space that hasn't really been defined very well.
And what is that problem?
It's this idea of how does the mind change the body, right? And people have fixated on the mind for quite a while. There's lots of people at UCSD and other places that are focused on meditation, mindfulness, mystical types of experiences, and they all focus on this. It changes, right? We know this. When people have these meditative experiences, we know that the mind changes in a unique way. The question becomes, what does this do to the rest of the body? And this is really where we come in. We're still studying aspects of the mind. We just finished this big paper on the fMRI study that we did in San Diego, and it looks amazing. It's going to go out for review hopefully soon to Nature Communications. And so we're still studying aspects of the mind, but the big idea is to define how this then changes the rest of the body in a healthy individual, and then in individuals that are not so healthy, right? Can the mind be a powerful tool to fix diseases that the body's dealing with from a chronic nature? Cancer, diabetes, hypertension, anxiety, depression, all these things. And can you create a framework to sort of understand this? It goes back to the stuff we were talking about earlier with the heart, right? The heart has this endogenous program that if you just tweak it in the right way and you stress it in the right way, it creates a biology that's then reparative. Could we do the same thing to the mind? Is there a way to tweak the mind in a certain way that gets it a positive stressor that then creates this unique transformation of the rest of the body?
So what did you think when Toby told you this? Of course, you always come to something with skepticism. That's kind of the scientific way.
True, right? I, as a skeptic, I later on with meditation. So in college, I had a guru. So it's interesting. My theology is shaped by two Germans of all people in the world. One was a German who went to India and converted to Hinduism, and he taught all of the Eastern religions at the university. So I took Buddhism from him, Hinduism, those kinds of things. He actually became my guru. So I went to his house. He taught me how to breathe. Most people in this world go around and live an entire life and they never learn how to breathe. There's a special way to breathe, right? So he taught me some yoga type breathing exercises and really to focus your mind and energy in a different space. And so that was my first real deep meditative experience, was with this relationship I had with him. And it was a mantra-based meditation that we had. And so he would ask you this just general question: what do you want in life, right? And that's a big loaded question. And I'd whisper something to him, and he would then whisper a mantra into your ear. The only time this is ever uttered out loud is when he whispers it in your ear. And then no one else in the world has the same mantra, and only he and I share this bond, right? I've never said it out loud. I've only thought about it. And when you think about it, you're supposed to resonate on the frequency of that mantra as an initial thought, and then let this go into this nothing space. And I did this for quite a while in college, forgot about it, and then sort of, became sort of engrossed with life, and you lose some of that element. But it never goes away. It's like riding a bike. We're talking about this now, and this mantra is now popping in my head. That's all I can think about, right?
I won't
And
ask
so
you to say it, so
I'm not going to say it because
I know.
I ruined this relationship with my guru.
Exactly, yeah.
And then the other German was this Renaissance guy who was the pastor at the local Lutheran church, spoke 7 languages, all of the biblical ones, right? Hebrew, Aramaic, Koine Greek, just an amazing guy who could talk about anything. He could give you a huge conversation on genetics and then move to the Gospel of John, which is his favorite gospel, and give you an entire sermon on the Gospel of John.
Just out of curiosity, why the Gospel of John?
So it is, there are 4 gospels, and there's what's called the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so they come from a back end where they're really written in a similar style, a similar category, similar aspects to this. John bucks the system. He goes completely different, and it's a different array of thoughts and patterns and where it sort of takes off. And John has more of a poetic aspect to it. So it's a non-canonical gospel. So it moves away from those other 3. The other aspect of John and the series that's really popular right now, The Chosen, is based very heavily on the Gospel of John. If you're to think about who has the most firsthand knowledge of Jesus, it would be John, right? So at the foot of the cross, Jesus says to John, "I give you my mother." And so John was tasked with taking care of Mary after Jesus died on the cross. And so she likely spent the rest of her life with John. And so I'm sure she told him crazy, amazing stories. And I think that's what's reflected in that, is the true Christ in that presence, and sort of who he was as a person is what comes out of that. And it's very poetic. Like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And, just the way it's written, it like has a resonance to it. And so this Dr. Appold was just a theologian, a scholar, just a Renaissance guy who was just an amazing individual. And so these 2 Germans really shaped my ideology of Western and Eastern theology. And it's something I've taken with me and carried. And even I think about it now and how they've shaped that sort of life. But it's been an amazing aspect of seeing that faith and other things grow into the science element of things that we're doing. And I think this is where the work that Toby and I are doing is really defining this next level of stuff, is that the mind has this power that we've never really thought about in a concerted way. And we've never really given it the credit that it deserves, right? It's a thinking, solving computer and a calculating machine, but it does way more than that. If you can train it, if you can coax it, if you can get it to this mental state where you're at this higher energy level, it is going to do what the heart does when it's stressed. It creates a euphoric aspect that then transforms the rest of the body in a positive way.
When was your first workshop, and what did you think when you were sitting there in the beginning?
Yeah, so the first one I ever went to was Indian Wells, which is the first study that Toby and I started. So it was our pilot study, and it worked out amazingly because Toby's based in Palm Desert. It's right in his backyard, and we could easily launch this thing. And jokingly, I've said, and maybe it's not really a joke, the only reason I went to that event is I wanted to meet Joe. We talked on the phone a few times and that kind of thing. But I grew up in Chicago. And so the Chicago thing is Portillo's hot dogs. And so there's a Portillo's hot dog in Riverside, like in Moreno Valley. And so my sort of stomach brain was thinking, if I go to see Joe in Indian Wells, on the way home, I can get a hot dog, right?
We know your weak spot now.
That was my motivation to drive to Indian Wells. So I got there. I got there late at night because I had to go after work. And then I stayed early morning for a few hours. We did a panel on stage. And then I walked off and then literally drove home, had a hot dog, and was back into my life. It was not what I was expecting, right? It was all this dancing, and it was like a rock concert. I'm like, how is this meditation? And my big skeptic mind was, how are we going to see any biology come out of this, right? We're collecting samples at this rock concert. And yeah, music has some impact on brains and bodies and things, but what's really going to happen? And I didn't really understand what the week long was, because that was my glitzy look at it, right? All the light show and all the music and people moving their bodies and stuff. But I didn't get to experience that long pause that you have during the meditations where you're going deep into your mind, body, and that connected state. So my first event where I actually participated was about a year later. Something called the pandemic happened.
Oh yeah,
with that.
Yeah, that thing.
And
Yeah.
so the Indian Wells was February of 2020, and then the world shut down in March. So we literally did nothing for a year with these samples. We sort of playing around with them in the lab. We did this COVID project, which is the paper that's published on this. But then a year after that, so April of 2021 was the first event I went to. And it took a lot of nagging from Joe and Toby. I mean, Joe would call me. He's like, hey, you want to come to an event and just experience it and see what it's like? I'm like, I don't know. I've got things to do. And then we started looking at that Indian Wells data, and it was astonishing. And I've shown this at talks at his events. And the person who goes through this, the new meditator, this is who I would be, right? A skeptic who's coming into this space, sees the music and like, no way is this going to change anything about me. I'm going to basically live for a week in a different environment. What's it going to do? We saw that these novice individuals completely changed their blood in this profound, unique way, right? They're expressing factors in there that didn't exist before. They become a new biochemical entity and a new biochemical person. And so the postdoc who was working on this project, Juan, and I decided, we got to go see what's going on, right? We got to check this out for ourselves. So we were doing another study in Orlando at the time. And Toby's like, hey, I got this. You guys go and experience the event because I want you to experience it. We'll take care of the science stuff. And so Juan and I threw ourselves into the event, and it was profound. I mean, I've described this. I cried the whole week. And a lot of the trauma I had from my mom passing and the way she passed was basically I got a call at like 3:30 in the morning from my dad saying, your mom's not waking up. And so my mind's going insane, right? I hadn't talked to her the night before, and we talk almost every day. And I never really got a chance to say goodbye. And so there's a lot of trauma tied to that. And during that week, all of that came back. And I never really cried after she passed away. And that entire week, all of that stuff that I'd sort of bottled up in the meditations, that was what I was releasing, right? And so it was a very emotional aspect for me. There were elements where, you get sort of shaky first time when you're doing this. There's, your body sort of jitters a little bit. Those jitters sort of worked out. And then it was really hard to quiet my mind. One of the things I think that these active brain individuals tend to have a trouble with, and my mind never stops, right? I'm constantly thinking about things and experiments and ideas and this and that email and connecting things together. To get that to sit quietly now was very hard. I was able to do this in college with my mantra. You do that mantra, you go into this deep, dark void, and I could get there. And I was sort of sad that I couldn't. I struggled. I mean, there's some meditations where all I could think about is, when is this going to end? Because my back really hurts and I don't want to sit where I'm sitting. And what Joe says is true. Work through all of that, right? You have to work through that pain, that agony, that sort of distraction to finally get to the point where it matters. And I think out of that 7 days, and I don't think I've ever told anyone this, there may be 2 minutes that mattered, right? There were 2 minutes of that time where my mind went into a space where it changed. There's some weird thing that came in that got to this state, and it wasn't a very lasting long state. It was 2 minutes, right? That entire 7 days was spent to get these 2 minutes of actual bliss. When I got home, my wife is like, you look like a completely different person, right? And so she noticed that I wasn't reactive. I seemed a little happier. I was more in a present moment state. And she tried to stress the shit out of me for like 2 weeks to get me to go back to that old sort of type and body and mind that I was in. And she noticed this difference as well. And people at work started noticing this difference. And it's interesting how you work through all of that. And all it takes is an instant, 2 minutes.
And then you can't go back.
You can't go back. Maybe it wasn't even 2 minutes. Maybe it was 30 seconds of this touching of whatever it was, this access to the divine, that I connected in a unique way. The other interesting thing that I had with this is I think my faith got even stronger after this, right? And one of the things that I get a lot of in this is, how as a Catholic can you do this, right? Doesn't this go against your Catholic beliefs and stuff? There's maybe one or two things that don't jive with the Catholic faith, but this is what the faith is about, right? This mystical experience that a lot of saints had was this touching and connection of the divine. And how do you create a relationship? And Joe calls it source. You can call it the divine. You can call it Jesus. You can call it Buddha. You can call it whatever you want. It's this access to something bigger and better than you are that this type of practice gives you access to. The closest I can get to with this in other aspects of my life are through prayer. And then what I've started doing during Eucharist is when I actually take in the body of Christ, is I'll actually go back to my pew, close my eyes, and go into this meditative state. And by practicing this at these Joe events, I can create that same sort of buzzing, like just mind-blowing feeling in my head in 30 seconds at the pew after I've taken in the divine by just imagining the divine permeating all of my cells and these other things. And it's a charging experience, right?
Yeah.
And so practice makes perfect. I think you got to do it over and over again. And you have to realize it's not going to come all the time. It comes at these fleeting moments, but those fleeting moments are transformative.
Yeah. What I've learned is, I've had a couple profound internal experiences, but I just do the work. And the first time I went to a Joe workshop, I was beating myself up. Like, everybody's having a divine internal experience. And I'm just, I'm a failure. Well. And, but as soon as I left that workshop, like everything started happening. Everything started lining up. I wanted to create a full-time job to finish my book. I wanted to create a mentor. I landed in Seattle. I got this message on LinkedIn. You got to apply to this job. I run into this guy on the street corner. As soon as I get into the city, he's like, you really got to apply to this job. And I wanted to create a mentor. And every day for 6 months, I went to a coffee shop to finish my first book. At the end of 6 months, I got laid off and I was like, yes, like I'm just going to work on my book all winter. And I was so lit up. I was in that expanded state. I walked out of the place and I said, what amazing things about to happen to me. And 3 minutes later, I got a text from Dr. Joe's assistant to help him editing stuff. And so then I got my mentor. It took 6 months, but then, I was working with Joe for 6 years and, obviously life-changing.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people they don't think it's working, so they quit, but it's just the practice. It's like any practice, you just do it, not for any reason, just to, I call it in the new book, it's like the practice is a way to carve out a path to God. And my practice since I was 17 has been writing. And when I get into that state, like it's the best feeling because it's just coming through me and I'm just typing, I'm sitting there typing. Sometimes I'm pounding on the desk like, holy shit, I can't believe this is coming through.
Right.
And it is that, like you said, it's that energizing feeling. It's an energizing, electric, expansive feeling.
Yeah. And it goes back to that 17-year-old self. I think if I were to define with one word what I was a seeker, right? I was seeking something.
Yeah.
There's something missing that I wanted to fill. And I think all of us are seekers and we're trying to fill it with these empty things. And I think for me, what it became in college was to fill myself with knowledge about things that I wasn't really knowledgeable about, right? And then as I advanced to the next phase to seek something else. And now I'm in a phase where we're really trying to seek sort of these divine truths that exist. And can we define them in a biological way of things that are already there? They exist, right?
Yeah.
These laws of physics, quantum biology, all of these things are there. We just haven't uncovered them yet. And that's what I'm seeking to ultimately do with this. And related to sort of your experience with this, when at my first event, I'm sure you've done these as well, we had these mind movies that you had to make. And I resisted this the whole event, right? The whole week before the event.
Yeah.
I'm like, this really sounds dumb. I don't know what I'm going to put together. And then the night before the event started, I started putting the slides together. And I think I called Hillary and I said, how do you pick a song? Can you just pick whatever song you want? She's like, yeah, whatever song you want. And for some reason, Coldplay's Fix You came into my mind. And so I put this mind movie to Fix You. And now I can't listen to that song without thinking of this stupid movie. Every time it plays on the radio or on my phone, the movie plays in my head. And the crazy part of this is I just threw things at the wall, right? Shit at the wall. Like crazy stuff that I knew would never come true. And
Yeah.
interestingly, 5 years later, 70% of that mind movie is fulfilled without me ever seeking it, without me ever trying to think about it, without me ever perseverating it. Putting it into the universe made it happen in this unique kind of way, right? It's profound. I don't know how that happened, but it does. And I think once you set your mind to something, it's just things start to fall into place and you make the right series of choices. We're always going like this, but I've done it in the right way that gets me to where I'm supposed to be, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I said in the new work I'm starting to pitch, it's like when you're in the alignment of the mind, body, and spirit, you become like the boring machine and matter starts to conform to your will. I mean, I put this crazy slide because I had to fill a slide. And it was like, I live in a place I love, in a community I love. And it was like this beautiful modern house and everything. And there was one point at this project and I was like, I got to get out of here. And I wrote down all this stuff. And then the next day, this kind of upset happened that pushed me out of it. Toby was the first person I thought to call. I come here and the first day I'm taking a picture from the backyard and I'm like, oh my God, this is right out of my mind movie. And it was like in the mind movie, the palm tree was on the left. And then in Toby's yard, it's like on the right. And then I put like Dr. Zach Bush in there, but I had no connection. You know, I always find it's the things that are the most outlandish because, you know, I guess there is no lack, as Joe would say. You're just like, okay, let's see what happens. Yeah. So what's some of the wildest things that have blown your mind, healing, transformations, anything like that you've seen at Joe's work?
Yeah, so I mean, we were putting this fMRI paper together, and one of the things that there have been lots of claims about the mind changing, right, and in unique kinds of ways, and one of the things that a lot of people are experimenting right now are with psychedelics. When you take psilocybin, acid, ayahuasca, ibogaine, those kinds of things, your brain goes to a different place. And what a lot of people describe this anecdotally as is an on-off switch for your brain, right? It's a way to power things down, and then your brain repowers and it defragments all the crap that's in there. What we noticed with Joe's work is by the end of the week, it looked like the people, when they were closing their eyes and going into this 15, 20-minute meditation, that they were doing exactly that. They were literally powering off their brain and it was powering back on. They were creating a psilocybin-like state without taking any exogenous psilocybin. That to me is nuts and profound, right? That you could train your mind in a week to be able to power on and off in this unique kind of way. And I think this is one of the resiliency things that we're looking at in terms of how the mind really changes the body. The question then becomes, when it's defragmenting, how does it fragment then the rest of the body and defragment other elements of it as well? And that's a huge program we're trying to solve right now with a variety of studies. So that was a big thing, that the mind really does change in this profound kind of way. The other big thing that we're seeing is that the information that this brain creates when it has this elevated emotional experience that's in a positive phase, it can get captured in the level of the blood, the urine, the breast milk, all of these fluids that we're making as humans, that then we then pass on to unique other places, are doing crazy, amazing things. Maybe not urine, right? You don't want to drink urine. There's a group.
Some people do. Yeah. But I doubt I ever will, but
I don't think I ever
I never
will
say never anymore, because then life's like,
you never know. It is a pure filtered liquid, but anyway, but blood, right? We donate blood, we give blood, we transfer blood to lots of kinds of things. And so it was intriguing to see that the information that the brain could create was transferred into the blood. We could take that blood and move it to a living system like a cell, or we're starting to play with little tiny microorganisms as well. You can move it onto these systems and it would change the biology of those systems in a positive kind of way. That was profound, that there's really an informational transfer that happens and it gets captured at this unique level. We've done this with breast milk as well. We're working on this big paper around women who meditate at these events that are breastfeeding. And one of the big things that are and being in the biohacker space and everyone wants to live forever. Well, sadly, our genetics is designed to kill us. And the only reason we exist is to create the next generation that gets the next evolved sort of set of genes. And then because we don't want to compete with that, our genes are designed to kill us off. And so we've been trying to solve this problem of the fountain of youth by looking at genetics. And I think it's other places. And we can talk about that. Maybe that's another podcast we can do on longevity and other things.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I do have, I want to, continue if you wanted to finish that.
But so we noticed that breastfeeding moms transform in this event, right? They look very different at the end. And so we asked, and actually it's sort of an interesting thing how this came about. We were doing this big study called the First Quantum Study in Marco Island. It's the quest to analyze 1,000 humans meditating. And the idea was that people were pissed off that they couldn't get into our study. So could we design a study where we wouldn't piss anyone off and anyone who wants to do it could do it? And so we're capturing Garmin wearable data. We were capturing microbiome samples from them to look at changes in the gut microbiome. And then we were getting surveys and cheek scrapes and things to look at epigenetics. A woman came up to me at this event and said, "Hey, I've got this for you." And I knew exactly what it was because I created lots of breast milk bags and frozen them in the freezer when we had our kids. And I'm like, I'm not ready for that. I'm like, what do you want to do? And then you start thinking about this. I'm like, that's actually a really cool idea. Maybe we should start looking at breast milk at these events. And so it took a long time. It, I think, took about 2.5 years. But we now have 12 women that were involved in our milk study where we got milk before the event started. And most of them were novice meditators. And then we got milk at the end of that 7-day event. And so now we could start looking at what the factors are in breast milk. The other crazy story, another woman came up to me and had the same idea around this and wound healing and some other things that we're looking at. She had just gotten married and they had a kid already. They were on their honeymoon, and this was during the pandemic. The husband caught COVID, was just sick, stuck in bed, non-meditator. She was a meditator. She was meditating, and she was breastfeeding. They were living in the same space in this tiny hotel room. Her and the child had no symptomology, nothing, whereas the husband was really sick. And so this idea that the breast milk created something because she's a mindfulness, she's a meditator, wow. She's a Joe person. And then she was breastfeeding this kid. So that information she was creating is now moving to this other life form in the form of this breast milk. And that information is now transforming how that kid is behaving and interacting with the world as well. Started thinking around this idea that this could really be a way to transform how the next generation really develops, right? Could we create a resiliency in this breast milk that goes way beyond? I mean, we all know that breast milk has important antibodies and properties and other things. And kids that get fed breast milk tend to do better developmentally, intellectually, and other things as well. Could this be the next evolution, right? Meditation milk. Could this take this to the next level of where this kid ends up? And so we've been characterizing this. So it turns out that breast milk changes in a dramatic kind of way. When you look at the proteomics before and after, they completely diverge, right? And so you see this huge shift in what the women are creating now in their biology and then passing it on to this child. And so that's been one of the other profound things in this is that the information we create, we can actually leave our bodies and transfer it somewhere else in a physical sense with blood, urine, and milk. You mentioned the coherence healings, and this is where it gets a little foo-foo wonky and my skepticism comes back in and we're still trying to resolve how all this works. But if you buy into this idea that this person creates this information, that information gets encapsulated, captured, and can transfer, can that information actually move in a unique kind of way? We've done a series of studies that suggest that possibly it does. As we've started working more and more with Joe and Toby and I've started thinking more and more about where we're headed, we're really moving away from looking at the individual at these experiences and starting to look more and more at the connectedness of the human society, right? And you've been to enough events that you see that the dynamic of the room shifts from day 1 to day 7.
Crazy.
It's a different interaction socially that people have. And so we think that that's what's leading to this gigantic rise in factors that we're seeing in the blood and this information that we're actually processing. And so we forced this in unique ways. So we did there's old studies done in Berkeley where they did these parabiosis experiments. So they took a young mouse and an old mouse and they hooked them up by their circulatory systems. And so they exchanged humoral factors. So the young mouse gave the old mouse unique factors, just like we see in the meditating human to the cells or the meditating breast milk into the child. There's factors that are created in this young system that when it gets into the old system, it makes the old system younger. So this is this whole idea about platelet-rich plasma, platelet-free plasma, exosomes from young to old people as a way to create resiliency and longevity. Maybe something there. So what we decided to do is not do that same experiment, even though I think people would allow us to hook them up by their circulatory systems. We did what we're coining a term called mental parabiosis. So we had them hang out together in unique sets. So we had young and old people that hung out together all week. And then we had young and old people that went through the retreat as they normally would. What we noticed in the individuals that were sharing their existence together, learning about each other and growing as individuals, but also as a group, as a couple, they were able to outperform the standard young and old individuals at the end of the week on cognitive tests. Their brain activity was way more elevated compared to these individuals. So it suggests that by being in the presence of someone and interacting with them, you can actually transfer information that way without any physical exchange of fluids, right? It's this mental energy that you're creating. And so this has gotten me thinking about the coherence healings in a unique kind of way. We know that they're profound. When you go through this experience, whether there's a placebo component to it or what, that healing modality creates a unique shift in the room. We've seen this in multiple devices that we've measured. And you see a transformation in that individual. We've seen people walk out of wheelchairs, get rid of their crutches, people with ALS start to walk, cancer disappear, all these amazing things that happen. And we're starting to think about how to measure this, right? And so we're going to start looking at the connected state of these individuals and see if there is this coherence that's formed and is there a relationship biologically that they're creating. But that's been sort of the far out thing that we've seen as well. Is how do you define what that healing thing is and what's the biology of all of that? I think that's going to be the next frontier of everything.
It must be so fun to just sit around and come up with these ideas and
it's like a kid in a candy store, right? You can literally dream up. And Kevin, who works with Joe to organize these, gets happily upset when I design a study and then we have our weekly meetings. Like, oh, we could do that. He's like, what now? And my mind's constantly thinking about what are other parameters and measures and things we can add into this that would really make this scientifically just far out from what anyone else is doing, right?
Yeah.
And so we're really thinking way outside the box and in really unique kinds of ways. And one of the things that's allowed us to do this is access to funding through Inner Science Research Fund, right? And other donors that have come into this space. The old model, it's still a model we use religiously in academia, is the NIH, VA, DOD, where you're writing grants. It takes a couple years for these grants to work through the system. You finally get the money. You're so exhausted by the time you get the money that you're just trying to sort of spin the wheels to get that thing going. Inner Science sort of breaks that model completely, right? They basically said, we're going to invest in you as a person and a group. And so we like the way you're thinking about stuff. We like the ideas you're coming up with. Here's a ton of money. Just do the things, right? Let's figure this out at a huge scale and see if it's going to go to that next level. It's allowed us to accelerate the science in unique kinds of ways. It may not be evident, right? Publications take a long time to work through the system. But the massive amount of data that we've generated is insane. It's just light years ahead of everyone else.
Yeah.
And it's allowed us to think about the human condition in a very profound, unique kind of way.
I want to ask you, I have a question specifically about mitochondria, but first I want to ask you about that moment you said when you talked about those 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Was your mind quiet when that happened?
It was. So that was, and it wasn't 2 minutes that were together. I think it was blocks of about 20, 30 seconds that I experienced in multiple meditations. And it was where you just go into this weird space where you're not in the room anymore. You know how I think about this all the time from a physiological perspective. You can be in a lot of pain and then eventually you fall asleep and that the pain's gone, right? And then you wake up and the pain comes back. So you're in a state of mind where that doesn't exist. So I was in a state of mind where I wasn't really aware of my physical body or anything like that. I was somewhere else, right? And it's 20, 30 seconds, I think, and accumulated over that week. It was about 2 minutes, I would imagine.
Yeah. Because when I've an active mind too, and I don't beat myself up for it. But when I get in those empty places, I get a lot of information for writing or whatever. And then I'll put my thumb on my lap. Like by the end, I might be like this because I'm like, I have to remember these 4 ideas, but it's always when that static dies down. And and then it's like my higher self. It's in my voice. It's almost lecturing to me.
Yeah. I've been having over the last couple of days, I've been having these intense dreams, and my alarm clock will go off, and it's a deep sleep I'm in. And when you're shocked out of that dream, you forget everything. So then I go back to try to recreate it. I'm like, where was I? Right. And I can't, my mind just loses it all. I typically have something at the side of my bed where I could just quickly jot stuff down, and I can't remember it. Right. And so I'm going to try to consciously make my unconscious aware of things I want to remember now and see what happens.
Yeah. Let me see if I can formulate this question. So we can say consciousness is intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So, and there are different levels of intelligence, such as, if you think of it as stratas going from humans all the way down, do you think, I guess you should probably explain what mitochondria is, but do you think mitochondria has a consciousness because it is performing this sort of innate function?
Yeah. I think mitochondria are a core element of consciousness, right? So if you think about the primordial cell that existed, it was probably made of some sort of metal kind of structures that then, I think a lot about sort of the origin of life, right? The evolution kinds of things. So if there was just this pool of material sort of floating around, life didn't exist until this pool got concentrated into a small space. And that concentration required a barrier, right? And so the membrane had to form first to then localize all of this material to this tight space. And then idea was that some of the early material was probably a combination of nucleic acid and protein that came together and created original life and allowed for this, then the present model to sort of form. In that evolution of that primordial first cell, this last common unified ancestor kind of thing, this LUCA tied to cell biology and all these things, what happened along the way is the cell became more and more complicated. And one of the big events that complicated the cell was the incorporation of bacteria into that tight space that then created this symbiotic relationship. So this first sort of bacteria that got incorporated sets were mitochondria and chloroplasts, right? So mitochondria and chloroplasts in plants, and then mitochondria in animal species that then gave rise to everything. So what the mitochondria then do is they give you this conduit to channel a lot of energy. They create a biochemistry that hyper accelerates your ability to create a source that then allows you to grow, get more complicated and other things. So from that original perspective, I think mitochondria could be sort of the priming step for how consciousness ultimately developed, I think, in higher beings. And
I love that. I love that because I have a theory that I haven't actually written it out, but I had this like download when I was going to see a show at Pappy and Harriet's up in the desert. And I was going to use it in the following book, but I got to rewrite some stuff. So I'm going to bring it into this. So mitochondria is not human DNA, right?
It's not. It's an old bacteria that got incorporated in, and they retain their own DNA. It's called plasmid DNA, so it's this circular DNA. It's tiny, right? There's only 34 genes on a mitochondrial plasmid, and it codes for 13 unique proteins that are critical to mitochondrial function. But when you look at a mitochondria, there's typically anywhere from 1,000 to 1,400 different proteins in mitochondria. So the bulk of the mitochondrial structure and components come from the nucleus of the cell and not from the actual mitochondrial genome. So there's this weird, crazy symbiotic relationship that's formed over eons.
So, I mean, for maybe people who don't know, like, can you define mitochondria? What is mitochondria?
Yeah, so mitochondria are old bacteria that get incorporated into our cells. From our perspective, from humans, and most species, they get transferred from the mother. So the bulk of the mitochondria are in the egg. The sperm uses mitochondria to basically create energy to move. And then when the genetic material mixes between the egg and the sperm, that forms sort of the nucleus. But then the mitochondria you inherit come from your mother. And so you can actually trace back using mitochondrial mutational analysis, the primordial Eve. You could literally trace back. And they've actually used mitochondrial DNA to track how human species migrated out of Africa. And you can see sort of patterns into Europe, patterns into Asia, and It all tracks through these mutations in mitochondria. So they become a really powerful tool to look at our evolution, our biology, and our migration and socialization. But then they become this conduit, right? It comes from your mom. So it's this connected sort of aspect to the divine. I was talking with Ben Greenfield last week, and he, sort of made this interesting connection between ayahuasca and mitochondria. It's the mother plant, right? And this information that this mother plant is giving you. And this idea that the mother is passing on to you these mitochondria. And it's this unique imprinting that they have that she's giving you, right? This consciousness state that comes out of this. This goes back to this whole religious circle as well. And one of the reasons why our kids were raised Catholic is in old world religions, the kids always followed the religion of the mother. And it was how they connected to the divine and spirituality. The mother was their spiritual guide. And so we made that decision very early on that the kids would become baptized and become raised in the Catholic faith because of that connection, right? And so there's this huge tie that we have to our mothers in this unique way. And it turns out biology doesn't let go of that either, right? It ties you instantly and directly to your mom because you're tied to those mitochondria. But then now you think about the egg and the sperm coming together, the bulk of the mitochondria really is a mixture of your mom and your dad because you're getting that material from the genetics that's coming out of your nucleus that then feeds into the mitochondria. But it's still this symbiosis. Most people think of mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, which is mostly true, right? It makes a lot of energy. But over this 1.5 billion years that they've been incorporated into cells, they've taken on a lot of other roles in the cell. They create basically the gatekeeping between cell death and survival. So they really are become sort of our conduit to life and death. One of the things that's essential to life is oxygen, right? And it's interesting that plants that have incorporated the other end of the element, they have mitochondria, but they also have chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are old bacteria that do the opposite of mitochondria. They basically take light energy and make oxygen at the end of the day. That oxygen then feeds into mitochondrial systems. Mitochondria take oxygen and make energy using that oxygen. So if you stop breathing, your mitochondria can't make energy and you basically die, right? And that's one of the aspects of it. So they really do tie you in a very sort of morbid way to life and death at the end of the day. It's all about your mitochondria. And so our longevity podcast, if we ever do it, could focus completely on this. I think the way to live longer is not through your genetics in an direct way, but it's really through optimizing your mitochondrial functionality, which could play into your genetics, but ultimately it's your mitochondria, I think.
So yeah, that which you developed a mitochondria kit to study it, or what is that? Talk about that.
Yeah, so we one of the cool things that I've had the opportunity to do at UCSD is really work with lots of people, and this was in my mind movie to take the esoteric science that we're doing in the lab and actually make this useful to humans in a unique way. And so we've been studying mitochondrial biology for probably 15, 20 years in the lab, and we have a really cool way of doing it in mice. Well, I can tell you everything about a mouse's mitochondrial functionality, from muscle to brain to heart to liver to their blood, everything, right? Who cares at the end of the day, right? And jokingly I say we've cured thousands of diseases in mice, which never have really translated into humans because we're not doing it in the optimal kind of way. And so these guys at Versailles, and again, Toby is my sort of Kevin Bacon and everything. I can connect everything.
6 degrees of Dr. Toby.
6 degrees of Toby. So Toby was working with these guys at Versailles. He was one of the founders of the company. He brought me in as a consultant initially. And these guys are visiting the lab and like, holy crap, you do so much stuff with these cool machines in mitochondria. They went home and actually formed a subdivision of the company called Versailles Discovery that was completely mitochondrial focused. They tried to get me to leave the university to become a part of this and run this. And I'm like, why would you give up a tenured position at an elite institution, right?
Very good
And so we
question.
were able to work out a conflict of interest with UCSD. I worked with them for a couple of years. And then now I'm an advisor for them as well. And we were able to develop this at-home commercial test where you literally bleed onto this blood card. The blood card separates your serum out. The system dries. It's super stable. The problem with this measuring mitochondrial function has always been that the gold standard is a muscle biopsy. You have to be at a research setting. They have to numb your leg up. They stick a needle into your muscle. They pull some of that muscle out. It comes to my lab, and then we analyze the functionality of that. It's low throughput, can't make any commercial money on it because you can do maybe 9 a week on this, and it's cost prohibitive. And so through a series of studies we did with NASA and other places, we were able to miniaturize this onto a blood card, which you can literally send anywhere in the world. They bleed onto this couple drops of blood. The blood then dries. It's archived at room temperature, so you don't even need cold storage. We put it into a pouch, comes back to our facilities. We punch the serum out. We've got you captured, right? So we have your biochemistry in that serum. And this goes with all the things we're doing with Joe and other places as well. That blood contains a lot of information that you're creating. It's your way of resolving the environment you're in. It's your way of expressing your genetics, your gut, everything feeds into the biochemistry in that blood. And so the idea is, could we take you that we've captured? I don't want to know a unique biomarker in this because who cares, right? Lactate may be up, citric acid may be down. You may have all these things, but how do you then take that and actually create a potential information? So we don't want to give you the potential of something that may or may not be there. We actually want to give you the functionality. So we take you that we capture on this blood and move it onto a living system that's never seen you. And we see how the mitochondria now on that living system behave as a reflection of what's happening inside you, because that serum is bathing all your cells, your organs, and other things. And so this test then becomes predictive of what's happening in your body with mitochondrial functionality. We can look at elements of energy metabolism. We can look at mitochondrial stress. We can look at free radical generation. We can look at mitochondrial networking and connectedness. So it really gives you a complete picture of who and what you are from a metabolic state. And this is really the start of it, right? We get these big questions: is who should be taking this test? If you're living and breathing and you have mitochondria, which everyone does, right? They're in every cell of your body except your red blood cells. You should know what your mitochondrial score is, right? You should know and do this test so you can figure this out. If it's great, do it once a year. Make sure you're maintaining. If it's not great, this gives you a way to start experimenting with ways to change your mitochondrial functionality. Whether it's a week at a Joe event, whether it's a supplement, lipids, other things that you can add into your system to change the trajectory of your biochemistry, to change that energetic profile. Energy becomes the key to everything, right? It's the key to growth, it's the key to life, it's the key to complexity. And
Thinking.
it's the key to consciousness, I think, at the end of the day, is how much energy can you generate?
Yeah. So then do you give recommendations on how they can change this?
We can, with the algorithms we have, will give you some ideas of where to start. As a cell biologist, it's really simple to fix your mitochondria. Right? 3 things that I suggest to everyone, and our test will help you figure out where on this 3-part spectrum. And maybe there's a back end thing. I keep thinking about the Trinity, right? It goes back to 3s. It's always 3s. And so one of the things that most people never think about in biology and their life is the membrane. When you ask people what's the most important part of a cell, no one will ever tell you the membrane. It is absolutely the most important part of a cell. If you don't have a membrane, you don't have life, right? You don't have existence. You don't have a demarcated thing that you can call a heart or a brain or a liver or a kidney. You need cells that then organize into this organ bed to do that. So the membrane becomes the key. Most people that have really horrible mitochondrial functionality have a dysfunctional membrane system. So their plasma membranes aren't very good. Their ER, their mitochondria, their nucleus, they need to build membrane structures initially. So this is the first thing we advise people that have really horrible scores on the me screen, is to think about ways to rebuild membrane foundational structures. So either through supplementation or changing a diet to have really good sort of fatty acids and things like that in there. Once you fix that, the next phase is really getting rid of death, dying, decay. So mitochondria are dynamic organisms inside our us as an organism. They're constantly connecting and moving and morphing and shaping and creating sort of a social system within our cells. And every one of our cells has this, right? Except for the red blood cell. And so one of the big things that we look at is these autophagy, mitophagy processes. As systems degrade in biology, we need to clear them out. And so you go through this self-eating phase, which is autophagy, or self-eating of mitochondria, where you basically recycle the mitochondria. In a lot of individuals that have chronic diseases, these processes are blocked. And so you can't undergo autophagy and mitophagy. But there's ways to do this. If you intermittent fast, if you do cold plunging, if you take certain supplements, you can actually activate these autophagy, mitophagy pathways. And so once you fix the foundational membranes, is to get rid of and clear all the death, dying, decay that's happening in your systems. Once you've done this, the third thing becomes easy. This is a balance that you've had to do from the minute you're conceived to the minute you die, is how do you deal with oxygen? This has been one of the huge problems with evolution as well, right? When we left water and went out to ground, living systems had to adapt to a huge amount of oxygen in the environment. And Nick Lane has a really good book on this called Oxygen, where he talks about the existence of lipids and biomembranes as a way to adapt to this high-rich oxygen environment. So it becomes that cholesterol actually was one of the first adaptations in living membrane systems as a way to live with high oxygen content. Cholesterol can hang on to oxygen and keep it from doing toxic things to the cell and to the cell body. So if you use oxygen the right way through mitochondria and other processes, what you create at the end of that is energy and signaling. If you use it to do the negative thing, what you create is a free radical. And so a reactive oxygen species then damages DNA, RNA, protein, lipids, and it really leads to this decline. And so the final of those three things you do is you create an antioxidant profile in your system. So you basically tamp down this reactive oxygen species network. So you're making energy and not these radicals that then damage your cell. If you get, and there's 1,000 ways to do these three things. And one of the things that our test allows you to do is, I've been jokingly calling it a bullshit detector, right? It allows you to see if that company that's marketing this mitochondrial supplement is the greatest thing and charging you $200, does this work in your system? It may or may not, right? And you get to now know if it actually does, because you can take a pre and a post test. So it's a
personalized, cool way to know. Much more personalized medicine. So what is the URL? Where can people find that?
It's mescreen.com. And what we could do is we can create a special discount just for this podcast, and we can work afterwards to then you could post it in the link.
Perfect. Yeah.
And if you want to follow stuff on mitochondria and some of the things we're doing in the lab, you can just sign on to my Instagram, which is Hemal Patel, PhD. And we send out pings on all kinds of mitochondrial biology on it every couple of days.
Next time, I would love to do longevity in the microbiome.
Yeah, be cool.
So I know you got to go, but who is a scientist you would have liked to have met?
That's a good question. I would have loved, I was watching Oppenheimer, and in Oppenheimer, he has these little side conversations with Einstein, and Einstein gets really pissed off at a certain element. I would love to have had an interaction with Einstein, right? To just pick his brain about where and how he thinks about the world. And this is where scientists like him don't see the way you and I see things, right? They see the world in a completely different kind of way. And to get access to that, right, would have been amazing.
Somebody's probably going to be saying that about you in the future, fella.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Well, is there any parting words you want to leave with, or what do you think? Where do you think this is all going? What do you hope to come out of Joe's work and consciousness? And
I hope we get to the core of consciousness, right? I think my scientific world has focused on a protein called caveolin for about 20 years. We've gotten it to a place where it's going to go into a clinical trial this year for ALS as a therapeutic target. But But at the core of the biology, it actually is a stabilizer of microtubules. And so this Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis that ties around microtubules and consciousness, it looks like my scientific world is going to come crashing in with my Joe world. And I think we're going to try to resolve this. The other thing that we've been studying with this protein is it ties to energetics. So one of the grants I'd written a couple of years back, that was a struggle to get, but it was probably the most profound idea I had, was that we proposed that this protein, which becomes sort of this conduit for everything and organizes it all, could be the way that our membrane living systems adapted a way to move oxygen in and out of the system. And so I think consciousness is a state of this utility of oxygen that ties to mitochondria. It's a utility of the structure that our neurons have and this ability to create this quantum tunneling aspect of it, and sort of supersupposition and all these other things that require that high level, sort of quantum level thinking and elevation. And then it's something that unifies all of those things together in a structural way. And we think that it may be this protein and its relationship. And we have some really cool models in the lab to study this. So we're super excited about that phase. At the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is you think, you make energy, and you exist, and you create, and you evolve, right? I think that's where we're all headed, to define that notion of how to do that in the best way possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was awesome. I also want to ask you about where AI is intersecting, but we'll get to that one on the next one and the possibilities of that. But I think you already said where people can find you, but you want to just say it again?
Yeah, you can go to mescreen.com for the mescreen test. And then if you want to follow me, it's just Hemal Patel, PhD on Instagram. And we put lots of posts on there from the lab, from meditation, from the mitochondrial world. You'll learn a lot.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see where all this is going. It's I've known Joe for 14 years, and it's just blown up from this little thing into this. And then you and Toby came into the world from, cloistered scientists to global rock stars. You've been on a very wild trip.
It's been amazing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Follow on Instagram at The Real Tim Shields, and same on YouTube, where this will be posted, and Apple and Spotify, all the places you can get it. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff. It really helps. And looking forward to a future conversation with this little rock star here.
All right. Great seeing you.
Thank you so much.